Okay, so tonight we have Linda Bazinet. She received her a Bachelor's of Science from U of T with a specialist in zoology, major in biomedical science, and then completed her master's in cell biology at McMaster. At IHN, Linda teaches biological chemistry, human anatomy and physiology, body metabolism, advanced nutrition research, and of course, endocrinology, which we're going to be chatting about a little bit this evening. Tonight, you're talking about melatonin, a powerful pineal gland hormone for much more than sleep. Thank you, Linda, for sharing your knowledge with us tonight. Go ahead.
I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. I know that you all have very busy schedules, and I'm glad that you made some time to come and spend with me on my very first webinar. I've never done anything like this before, and I have to admit I'm a little bit nervous about it. I'd be more comfortable if we were in a classroom and I could actually see your faces. So this is a little bit different for me, but I've been teaching for a long time, so I think we should be okay. What Julia didn't say when she went through my bio is I've actually been teaching since the mid-1980s, and I've been teaching at IHN since 1996. So I've been interacting with these students for a long time, and I'm not sure who's present tonight, but I think there's people from a wide range of years as well. So the topic tonight is melatonin, and I'm going to share my screen with you because I've got a slideshow on melatonin. And I know as soon as people think about melatonin, what they think about is sleep. That's always what you think about with melatonin. And yet when you start looking into it, there's so much more. And the much more is really interesting. So we're going to start by taking a look at the pineal gland, which of course is the gland where melatonin is made. It is located in the third ventricle of the brain, actually almost right in the middle of the brain. It is small, it's cone-shaped, and if you look at the dimensions, is what, 5 to 8 millimeters by 3 to 5 millimeters, so less than a centimeter all around. And we say cone-shaped, and it's actually pine cone-shaped, and the name comes from the Latin pinea. The pineal gland was first seen by researchers in ancient Greece. So we've known about it for more than 2,000 years. It's been referred to as the third eye. And one of the reasons for that is it seems to be related to what's called the third eye in some species of fish, frogs, amphibians. And that third eye sits on top of the head, is covered with skin, and is actually photoreceptive. And it is related to the pineal gland. But we've also talked about the pineal gland as being the third eye in a mystical way. So there's been all kinds of suggestions as to what the pineal gland might be responsible for. René Descartes called it the seat of the soul. Descartes thought that all of our thought originated in the pineal gland. Now, it turns out that Descartes was a much, much better mathematician than he was a biologist, and he's not right about that. But it's still very, very interesting. The pineal gland is controlled by light. Now, because it's deep inside the brain, no light actually reaches it, so the light has to come in by what's seen by the eyes, and it's actually what's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It's just the optic tract that's going to bring the light signals in so that we get a response to light, even though the light's not hitting the pineal gland directly. And so if you look at this diagram of the brain, and I know it looks kind of busy because there's a lot of labels there, but in the very center is the third ventricle. So it is very much almost in the middle of the brain. And the pineal gland is just off to the side. It's part of what they call the epithalamus. And if you look at the photographs, this is a photograph of the brain, and you can see there's a pineal gland, and up close, when you look at it up close, it really does have that shape of a pine cone. Here we can see that when light hits the eye, signals are taken through that suprachiasmatic nucleus. into the pineal gland. And you notice it's the red line there with the bar, which means that when light is received, that means that we stop making melatonin. So melatonin is made when we don't have light. You can see that's the structure of melatonin here. And we'll look a little bit about this synthesis pathway. It's actually a relatively simple pathway to make melatonin. Melatonin itself was discovered in 1958. So we've known about it for, what would that be, about 60 years? Looking at the sequence, you notice that it starts with tryptophan. So to make melatonin, we begin with tryptophan. And there's a few steps. We go to 5-hydroxytryptophan, 5-HTP, then to serotonin, and then N-acetylserotonin, and finally to melatonin. What's interesting about this is that in the pineal gland, we have got more serotonin than we have anywhere else in the body. That the levels there are higher than they are anywhere else. But serotonin also is made elsewhere in the body. For example, you might know that serotonin is made in the gut. In fact, I think 90% of our serotonin is made in the gut. And that gets into the blood, but it doesn't get into the brain because serotonin doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. Melatonin does. That's another interesting thing about melatonin, is it does cross that blood-brain barrier. Here we're looking at the synthesis of melatonin as we go through the day. And you'll notice that melatonin peaks at night. So you can see that in the daytime, there's at 7 o'clock, if you go to the end, you look at 7 o'clock in the morning, very low levels of melatonin. And it stays low right through until we get into the evening. And then the pineal gland starts making more and more melatonin until we get up to the middle of the night. Because melatonin goes through that up and down throughout the day, that's why we're going to see that it is involved in circadian rhythm. It also means that because it is affected by light, that if we get light pollution, if we have, it's particularly the blue light that interferes with the melatonin production. So if we have blue light in the evening, that's going to interfere with our melatonin production, and that's probably going to interfere with our ability to sleep. A lot of people, therefore, use blue blocking goggles. I see people walking around wearing those goggles, or you've got apps on the phone or the computer that interfere with the blue light so that we don't interfere with the natural melatonin production. That's why if you're gonna have a night light for kids, you don't wanna have a blue light, you wanna have a red light because it's gonna interfere less with melatonin production. This one's very cool. This is looking at melatonin production throughout a lifetime. And you'll notice at the very left-hand side, babies, newborn babies make minimal amounts of melatonin. So when that 6-week-old baby gets you up in the middle of the night, they have absolutely no idea. They do not know if it's day or night. But we start to make melatonin by the time we're 3 or 4 months old. So when that 6-month-old baby gets you up in the middle of the night, they know. You'll also notice, looking at this, that melatonin levels are very high in childhood. And if you think about that, it also makes sense because children sleep more than adults. You'll see, and it looks like it's in around, 12 years old, melatonin starts to decrease. And some of that decrease in melatonin might be responsible for the timing of puberty. And you'll see, I think it's on one of my slides coming up, that melatonin actually affects the production of the hormones from the brain, the gonadotropins FSH and LH. And so that change in melatonin might be responsible for when we actually have puberty. You'll see as well that melatonin continues to decline, so that once we get to be older, particularly over the age of 60, there can be quite low levels of melatonin. And obviously this is an average. every individual is going to be unique. So not every individual is going to have exactly these levels. But we do find that older people have much lower levels of melatonin, and that might be responsible for some of the sleep difficulties that older people often have. As we said, and as you know, melatonin secretion increases in the dark. So it's made when it is dark. One of the findings that melatonin affects circadian rhythm is that we can give it to people who are blind. People who are blind can have what's called a circadian rhythm disorder. So they have trouble with alignment with our normal daily rhythms because they don't have the signals that we have. Giving them melatonin helps get them into sync. What we find is that melatonin is a sleep trigger in diurnal animals. So in animals that are naturally active during the day, and this immediately when I say animals, all of a sudden you realize that melatonin is not just human, it's found in animals as well. And so in animals that are naturally active during the day, melatonin tells your body it's time to sleep. Humans, of course, are meant to be diurnal, which means that we are supposed to be naturally active during the day. We have a tendency to extend our days by artificial light, but we are naturally diurnal. In animals that are nocturnal, they still get melatonin at night, but it increases their activity. So nocturnal animals actually have a different response to melatonin. What we find is that melatonin supplementation does help people sleep. It helps people fall asleep. It helps people stay asleep. That doesn't mean it's going to work for everyone every time, because there are a lot of reasons for not sleeping. Melatonin is just one of them. We find that people who work at night have reversed melatonin secretion patterns. And it's not completely reversed, but it's also not right. And this may well be responsible for some of the health issues that people who work shift work face. There's a lot of different health conditions that are increased in people, and they've done a lot of studies on nurses, because nurses often work shifts, and we know that they've got increased risk of cardiovascular disease, increased risk of cancer, and so on. And some of that might have to do with poor sleep. Some of that might have to do directly with changes of melatonin secretion. People who go from one time zone to another, so who are suffering jet lag because their body hasn't adjusted to the new time zone, melatonin is being produced at the wrong time for where they are, and that certainly affects their ability to sleep. By giving melatonin supplementation, that helps many people. Again, doesn't help everyone, but it helps many people adjust to that change in time zone. When we give melatonin to people who are working shift work, it does seem to help them sleep better. There's quite a few studies that have been done on this. It's not a cure-all. It would be better for people not to work shift work, to be perfectly honest. But it does help them fall asleep faster, and it does increase the length of sleep that they have. It's still not ideal, but it is an improvement over not using melatonin. In animals, melatonin is involved in the timing of migration and in the timing of hibernation, which is interesting because you can almost think of hibernation as a really deep, really long sleep. And melatonin seems to be a trigger for animals as to when to do this, because of course, as the day length changes, we get changes in the secretion of melatonin. So it helps animals know what to do when. They've done some interesting work on some birds with migration and looking at melatonin production and finding that it is involved in helping them decide when to fly, and not only what time of year to fly, but some of these birds are naturally, even though they're naturally diurnal birds, they fly at night, and melatonin seems to be encouraging them to do just that. So this is looking at some of the aspects of melatonin and fertility. I had mentioned this when we saw the slide that showed that melatonin, when it decreases, increases the chance of puberty. So melatonin suppresses gonadotropin secretion. So FSH and LH. FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. LH is luteinizing hormone. These are both secreted by the anterior pituitary in response to something called GnRH. GnRH is gonadotropin releasing hormone. It's made by the hypothalamus. So melatonin is actually going to interfere with GnRH action, which means that it's going to suppress the release of these hormones, which are needed for fertility. If we give melatonin to rats, for example, it delays their sexual maturity. And this is what we were saying, since melatonin secretion decreases as puberty approaches, it may affect the timing of puberty in humans. One of the concerns and one of the questions is we have earlier puberty with children these days. We do seem to see an effect that way. And the question is light pollution part of the story? Because there's so much light, it's never dark, that we're getting probably an interference with melatonin. Does that decrease in melatonin actually cause early puberty? And the answer is we don't know. It might. It might be one of the factors involved in that. I don't think it's the only factor involved in early puberty. Certainly we have a lot of environmental hormones that may be having an effect. Also, I think that some of the earlier puberty might come down to obesity because heavier girls tend to get their periods earlier. But is melatonin a factor? It might be. And that begs the next question. If we give melatonin to our kids to help them sleep, and a lot of people do that, does it cause late puberty? And the studies that I've looked at don't seem to show a clear effect. I mean, certainly the studies that we had with rats suggested that might be the case, but I'm not sure that we can prove that it happens in humans. Having said that, I probably would not want to give melatonin to a child on a regular basis. I think giving it to them occasionally may well be helpful, but I'm not sure that we want to do this daily for them. In animals, in animals, melatonin times seasonal fertility. So unlike humans, many animals are only fertile for short time periods. Melatonin seems to time when that happens. Now, there are two types of breeders. There are what are called long day breeders and short day breeders. So sometimes the animals become fertile in the spring when the day length becomes very long. So examples of animals that do that are horses and groundhogs. Some animals actually become fertile in the fall when day length decreases. Sheep and goats are examples of that. So melatonin actually seems to be involved in both cases. And you'll see it, and there's a fairly detailed diagram here looking at, you can see at the top it says amount of light, amount or time pattern of light seen by the eyes each day, hitting the retina, and then going through to the pineal gland. And you'll notice that when we have long days, and that's down the bottom, and so our long days are less than 13 to 14 hours of darkness, so really 12 hours or more of light, we have less melatonin. That's the red bar. We have less melatonin. Therefore, we're going to get the secretion of the FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary acting on the gonads to encourage fertility. When we have short days, we're going to increase melatonin production, and that's going to inhibit the anterior pituitary from releasing these hormones. But the thing with that is it only works for about 4 months, and then the pineal gland breaks out of the inhibition and we get the fertility anyway. So it kind of holds off fertility for that length of time for the short breeders. You'll notice the other statement here, which I find interesting, that we use long days, arbitrarily long days, to promote egg laying in chickens. So we do that in our factory farms, unfortunately. So far we've seen melatonin is important for sleep. melatonin is important for fertility. The next thing on my list is mood. And you, again, this is something you may well be familiar with, that melatonin has effects on mood. Seasonal affective disorder, I always think the acronym there is really appropriate because it's SAD, may be associated with a misalignment of circadian rhythm. As the days become shorter, because it's less than 12 hours, our circadian rhythm may not line up correctly, and that misalignment seems to lead to depression, at least in some people. Some people are much more sensitive to this than others. Many people see a minor downturn in mood during the winter, but some people actually become clinically depressed. SAD is treated with light therapy. That's very often what we do, and we use light therapy in the morning. Now, I don't suffer from SAD, but my husband does have some problems with it, and I bought him a light therapy box, and it makes a world of difference for him. What's interesting is we can also treat it with melatonin later on in the day. So it's not that it is too much melatonin, it's melatonin perhaps at the wrong times. And so melatonin can also be helpful in treating SAD. It's not surprising to me that melatonin affects mood, because you saw that melatonin is pretty closely related to serotonin. And serotonin, of course, is very closely associated with mood. This is perhaps one of the most interesting things I found when I was preparing for this seminar, is that melatonin is ubiquitous. I knew that melatonin was found in animals, in humans and animals, and I even knew it was found in plants. I didn't know it was found in bacteria. As a matter of fact, it probably evolved there. So melatonin is an ancient, ancient molecule. And when it evolved in bacteria, well, bacteria don't sleep. And bacteria, I don't think they have moods. And they certainly don't have sex the way we think of having fertility. So it doesn't do any of those things there. What it does in bacteria is an antioxidant. It is a free radical scavenger. And that's probably the first role of melatonin. And maybe the most interesting role of melatonin is as an antioxidant, because it is one of the very few antioxidants that crosses the blood-brain barrier for us. This being evolved in bacteria is where it came from, and we actually find that in plants, an antioxidant. In plants, melatonin promotes seed germination, it promotes growth, it promotes immunity in plants. I know we don't think of plants as having immunity, but they can actually get sick, and they have an immune system as well. For plants, modulate circadian rhythm. So some of the photoperiod response in plants is due to melatonin. Also in plants, fruit ripening. So all of these things, melatonin. As I said, melatonin is a very potent antioxidant. We discovered that in 1993. So we discovered melatonin in 1958. In 1993, we figured out it's a really good antioxidant. And as I was saying, one of the very few antioxidants that can cross that blood-brain barrier. It increases glutathione levels. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with glutathione. Probably you are, because I know it's a very, very key antioxidant inside cells. It's a pretty simple molecule, but it's hard to supplement because it doesn't get absorbed particularly well. So the fact that melatonin can increase those glutathione levels, and glutathione is one of the best antioxidants inside your cells, is very interesting. In fact, melatonin is found inside your mitochondria. I always thought, melatonin, pineal gland, well as other places. It's found inside your mitochondria. In fact, your mitochondria may actually make melatonin. I don't want to go too far off topic, but the reason that that might be is of something called the endosymbiont hypothesis, where we believe that the mitochondria used to be bacteria. and they were taken up into our cells and developed a symbiotic relationship with the nucleus. Therefore, that melatonin that they make came from the bacteria that made melatonin. And we think the melatonin in mitochondria might help neutralize the free radicals, which are an inevitable byproduct of doing aerobic respiration. Probably because melatonin is such an effective antioxidant. It has been investigated to treat disease. And when I start reading about all the things that melatonin might be used to treat, I'm starting to think that it might cure a rainy day, which if you're in Toronto with me, today was a very, very rainy day, so maybe we needed some more melatonin today. So all of these things I'm going to list, there is evidence for this. It's not just things that we're making up. This is actually, there is research evidence to suggest that melatonin might treat things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Well, again, antioxidant going into the brain. Cancer, a wide variety of cancers may well be affected, may well be treated by melatonin. That includes breast cancer, brain cancer, cancer of the lung, the prostate, the GI tract. So a wide variety of cancers might be treated with melatonin. Looking at a number of mental health issues like depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disease. Again, I think about the connection to serotonin when we start looking at some of these conditions that melatonin might be able to help. Fibromyalgia, diabetes. And I didn't list them all because it was just too many to write down, but I can run through some of the other diseases that melatonin just might be able to help. They include epilepsy, COPD, so chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, endometriosis, tinnitus. I said this earlier today and my son said, oh, really? Because he has tinnitus. And so I think he might see if it helps with that. Non-alcoholic liver disease, chronic fatigue, restless leg syndrome, nerve pain, migraine, BPH, which is benign prostatic hyperplasia, IBS, osteoporosis, infertility, symptoms that some women may get when having gone through menopause. It might be helpful there. As I say, as you go through all that list, I'm starting to think that it just might cure a rainy day. This diagram is looking at some of the way that melatonin might affect Alzheimer's. You can see starting in the upper left where the arrows are, nocturnal exposure to light. So we have the eye. You can see, then if we have light, you're not going to get melatonin. So that's what we get. You see over on the right-hand side, suppression of melatonin synthesis. And that leads at the bottom, you see, to oxidative stress. So again, this comes with the role of melatonin as an antioxidant. In addition to the oxidative stress, plus the circadian dysfunction by having the light when you shouldn't have light, you get amyloid plaques. So amyloid is a protein that's supposed to be there, but it's an abnormal structure. We also have tau, which is another protein. We get the pathology of that. And those two together can lead to Alzheimer's disease. With the presence of melatonin, we decrease the oxidative stress, we decrease the formation of these abnormal proteins. So melatonin, sleep, fertility, antioxidant, treating so many possible diseases. And now we see melatonin as affecting immunity. Its effect on immunity might well be due to some of the effect as an antioxidant. But we see that melatonin has general immuno-enhancing effects in humans and in animals. Actually made by some of your white blood cells. So lymphocytes. Remember, lymphocytes are B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. They're involved in our specific immunity. Melatonin stimulates innate or what we call non-specific immunity. That's the immunity that's always present, that doesn't need to learn, it's just there. It augments NK cells. NK cells are natural killer cells. They go after infected cells, so your cells that are infected with a virus. They go after transplanted cells, so if you have a transplant, they will actually go after it, but also cancer cells. And melatonin encourages them to do more. It stimulates neutrophils and macrophages. Neutrophils and macrophages, I often think of as being part of the cleanup crew, because they're going to, very often what they do is they eat your invaders, the bacteria and viruses that are making you sick, perhaps. So it stimulates the innate or non-specific immunity, but it also stimulates specific immunity. It elevates the antibody responses, so we get more antibodies. It increases helper T function. I always say that helper T cells are in human resources because they stimulate other cells to do their very best work. And they also recruit new cells to join the battle. So melatonin encourages all of these aspects of immunity. But wait, there's more. We're looking at more roles still of melatonin. So that aging may be associated with free radical damage, and that's probably not a surprise to many people. We talk about a lot of things decreasing as we age, but free radical damage and inflammation tend to increase as we age. And we, interestingly, they talk about immunosenescence, so the aging of the immune system, which might be associated with our aging. And if you think back to one of those first diagrams that I showed you, melatonin decreases significantly in around age 60, which makes me a little bit nervous because I'm not that far from 60 myself. But that decrease in melatonin might be responsible for that drop in immunity that we see as well. So we think that melatonin might help slow the aging process. One of the things that we do know, and the studies to find out whether or not melatonin can make people live longer are hard to do. There have been studies done on mice. And the reason, of course, we work with mice is because they don't live that long. So it's much easier to see if we've increased their lifespan. And so melatonin might be able to do that. One of the things that we know, and one of the few things that we know increases lifespan is calorie restriction. So eating very little makes you live longer. And so they say reducing calories by about 40% increases lifespan 30 to 50%, so almost half as long. Now, that's not done in humans. Those studies are really hard to do in humans because humans live a long time. But in mice, rats, dogs, and monkeys. But that seems like a tough thing to do. Eating 40% less, I don't know, you might have more willpower than I do, but I think that's going to be hard. But one of the things that it does is it increases synthesis of melatonin by the gastrointestinal tract. Wait, melatonin is made here too? Melatonin is made in your GI tract as well. And by the calorie restriction, we increase the GI tract melatonin, and it might be that some of that increase in life that we get from calorie restriction is going to be indirect through melatonin acting as an antioxidant. I'm just thinking I'm going to skip all that not eating and try to see if I can increase my melatonin. So evidence does suggest that melatonin supplementation may increase lifespan. As I say, most of it's been done on mice, but something new, relatively new, is there are now creams coming out, skin creams, where melatonin is being used topically to prevent the aging of the skin. And again, that must be through its antioxidant properties. Here's one of the sad things. As we age, the pineal gland tends to calcify. And there's a lot of biological evidence to say that it does that. And it looks like it's not a natural process, that it does, well, maybe it's a natural process, but it does interfere with the production of the pineal gland. So it certainly is not something that is desirable. So it doesn't just happen in humans, it happens in animals as well. And so that's probably in large part responsible for that drop of melatonin production as we get older. One of the things that's concerning, though, is that fluoride increases the calcification. The pineal gland seems to concentrate fluoride, so fluoride makes the calcification worse. So ideally, what we want to do is not expose ourselves to fluoride. I know that having fluoride in the drinking water is controversial at best, and it seems to have negative effects on the pineal gland. I know that there's some work being done to try to see if you can remove fluoride from the pineal gland using some chelators like EDTA. Ideally, of course, we just don't have the fluoride there in the first place. So after all of this, it certainly seems like supplementing melatonin seems like a good idea. And this is one of the very few hormones that you can walk into the drugstore and pick it off the shelf and take it home. Therefore, people do it all the time. It is commonly supplemented to facilitate sleep. Now, how much are you taking? If you want to get a level that is similar to what your body produces, you take about 0.5 milligram, but nobody takes 0.5 milligram. If you go above that level, it's what we would call a pharmacological level. So not what your body would naturally produce, but more than that. When you go to the store to buy it, you're probably going to find 3 milligram, 5 milligram, and 10 milligram tablets. You can get higher ones as well, but those are the common ones. And I'm not promoting any particular brands. It just happens to be a picture here. This is one of the ones that's available at Shoppers Drug Mart. This is 3 milligram tablets of melatonin. And so very, very easy to get, very commonly taken. So even though I said 0.5 milligram was physiological, there have been studies where they give people up to 2 grams. That's 2,000 milligrams, and no serious side effects. So you can take a fair bit without running into trouble. That oral melatonin that you take is absorbed in about 30 minutes. So people will you typically take it at least half an hour before they want to be sleeping. Its half-life in your blood is about 45 minutes. So while you're going to get a spike, if you take, say, a 30 milligram tablet, which is quite a lot, you get a spike that goes 50 times what's normal. But then because it's being broken down, half-life is 45 minutes, in 6 to 10 hours, it's going to be gone. The trick with taking melatonin is making sure that it's been cleared by the time you wake up. If it hasn't been cleared by the time you wake up, you're going to wake up feeling a little bit groggy. So if that's the case, either you took too much or you didn't stay in bed long enough. One of the important things to note, and I've had a lot of people ask me this particular one, is that if I take melatonin, am I going to become dependent on it? And the answer seems to be no. You do not get habituation to the melatonin, so you're not going to have to take more and more and more to get the same effect. The other point, and I think this is another important one, is that it does not interfere with the natural production of melatonin. The secretion of melatonin is not based by how much melatonin is in your blood, it's based by how much light's hitting the eye. So taking supplementation does not affect how much your body's going to make naturally. Now, no supplement is perfect, and there are sometimes side effects to taking melatonin supplementation. Some people will experience them, some people will not. Some people get headache and dizziness. The one that I hear more often than not is nausea. So that's the one, the negative one that I hear from people most of the time. I'm amused by seeing the side effect of drowsiness being listed, and it's usually why people are taking it, is to become drowsy. The other one is not listed here, but the other one that I've come across a number of times is what's called lucid dreaming. So sometimes people, when they take melatonin, have very vivid dreams. Some people like that, some people don't. I know my son took some melatonin, had those vivid dreams, and said he was never going to take it again because he found the experience to be quite unpleasant. The other thing to be careful about is melatonin can interact with some medications. The most commonly taken ones that it can interfere with would be blood pressure and diabetes medications. Well, those are really important because they're commonly taken medications. It kind of bothers me because I know that melatonin can help treat diabetes, but it interferes with diabetes medications, and that's a problem too. There are food sources of melatonin because melatonin, as I said, is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. Bacteria make it, plants make it, animals make it. So many, many foods have melatonin in it. Good examples, fruits and vegetables. The ones that I see listed most often are the first two: cherries, I think tart cherries in particular, corn, but you can see as well asparagus and tomatoes and pomegranate, olives, grapes, broccoli, and cucumber. Grains, rice, barley, and again, the one I see mentioned most often are the rolled oats, nuts and seeds. Pistachios actually are a good source. Walnut, peanuts, sunflower seeds, mustard seed as well, and flaxseed. And then beverages. It shouldn't surprise you to see that beer and red wine have melatonin in them because both of those can make people sleepy. It is a little surprising to see coffee because certainly coffee doesn't make people sleepy, although it does have antioxidant properties. Well, that's actually the end of my presentation. One end, it was something positive with the food sources, although I think many, many people are going to be interested in supplementing it as well. So I hope that you enjoyed the presentation. I hope that you learned something from this along the way. I certainly learned a fair bit as I was preparing for it. And when I do get into the endocrinology course, which by the way is my little ad, it runs for 7 Tuesdays starting after March break. And we're going to talk about not just melatonin, but all of the major hormones. And for all of them, there's much, much more to them than you think at first. So I would be really delighted to have some of you come and join me for that course. Okay, Julia, do you have anything for me to do at this point?
I'd like to thank you.
You're very welcome.
For your time, your knowledge, and your willingness to share very generously. So we all very much appreciate it. And hope to see some folks in your course. And that's coming up when?
It starts right after March break. So what is that? I think it's the 20, is it Tuesday night? Is that the 24th of March?
It is 24th, yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, very good.
For 7 Tuesdays.
Okay, thank you. And again, people are thanking as they sign off. Very good. So good night. I'm going to stop now. I'm going to cut out, and you have a good sleep.
Everybody have a good sleep.
Yes. Okay. Good night, everybody.
Okay. Good night.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.